Hi, I'm John Polius, the author of the Language and Learning Development Continuum, and in this video I'll be taking you through the principles that the Continuum is founded on, its structural features, and some advice about using it. Let's begin with the title of the Continuum itself. It's both a language continuum and a learning continuum. That's based on the theoretical premise that the two, language and learning, are inextricably linked. So by developing language, one is learning. But it's not simply learning more and more topics. Since, as children age, the meanings they wish to make, that they're expected to make, and that they're expected to understand become more and more complex, their language development is about developing the language resources for those more complex meanings. And that's what the continuum describes. The language resources that a student needs to develop to make the meanings expected in the curriculum. Or to say it another way, the continuum tracks a typical pathway in a student's development over the years of schooling. A simple definition of schooling is that it's concerned with teaching students how to take an increasingly technical and abstract perspective on the everyday world around them. Now, for this to occur successfully, a student needs to be able to develop the language resources to make those increasingly technical and abstract meanings, and that's what the continuum does. It identifies where a student is located in their development of language and learning. Now, for the school community, the continuum provides the data for reporting the development of the students. For parents, the use of a phase number is a simple tool for them to understand where their child is compared with where they're expected to be. For teachers, the continuum provides information that could be crucial to their lesson designs and teaching. And for students, it can in simple terms tell them where they are at and where they should be, but because of the detailed descriptions, it can be much more. It can be, as it can be for teachers, a checklist of what they can do and then what they can work on to get to the next phase. Now, we think of the continuum as a reporting tool rather than an assessment tool. But what's the difference? A good assessment tool that's based on the functional model of language would typically have a set of criteria specific to the genre and register of the text being assessed. The continuum, however, isn't specific to any one genre or register. And this is clear when you see that the continuum has two macro organizers, text and contexts, and language. One advantage of its function as a reporting tool is that it can be used with any assessment tool that your school may be using. What we'll do now is get you familiar with the structure of the continuum and some of its content. Here is the continuum as it is represented in the table on the cover page. For our purposes, we are using the version for students 11 to 15 years of age. Let's take a closer look and begin with the curriculum benchmarks or milestones. These are just a label for the kinds of things a curriculum would typically have, usually specified according to the subjects or disciplines that make up a school's curriculum. The benchmarks you use will be determined by whichever curriculum documents you are using. For example, the International Baccalaureate has its own benchmarks or milestones. What is important to recognize about the continuum is that it combines benchmarks from across the disciplines. In other words, the descriptions in the continuum are not solely for science, nor economics, nor history. The continuum describes the language a student is expected to use to be able to achieve the expected standards of their age across the board. Finally, no matter the curriculum, we could safely assume that the average 11-year-old student at a typical school anywhere in the world will be expected to learn similar kinds of knowledge, aptitudes, or skills. We then have the various phases of development according to age groups. Each age group starts at phase 1 because there might be students at any age who are starting to learn in the language of the classroom. Each age group then continues through the various phases to a typical endpoint, which is the curriculum benchmark. A student can be anywhere along this continuum, at any of the phases. Some students may be a phase or two behind where their peers are, while a few students may be at a level further than their expected benchmark level. Generally, and this depends a lot on how your school addresses the students' language needs, your students will be located around 2 or 3 phases. This is for students between 11 and 12. And this is for students aged between 12 and 13. Finally, it wouldn't be unusual to have a couple of students aged between 13 and 14 who are able to consistently use the kind of language that we would expect for older students. So, to repeat, the Continuum is intended to be a manageable reporting tool because the range of student achievement isn't too great, acknowledging that there might be a couple of students in your class who are at either end of the Continuum. Now, let's go through the organisation of the Continuum, and we'll use the field Continuum for 11 to 15-year-old students for our purposes, but we could have used genre, tenor, or mode. You can see here that there are a series of outcomes for each phase. These are very broad descriptions, maybe too broad to be useful for teachers and students alike, but they could be useful as broad brushstroke indicators for the school, for system-wide reporting, and for parents. The 2 organising tools are text and contexts, and language. The text and context organiser describes the sort of texts that are expected to be comprehended and composed by students, and the kind of context in which they do that. As with the whole Continuum, the descriptors are aligned as much as possible so that the reader can read across the Continuum according to each bullet point. So bullet point number 1 across each phase would typically describe similar facets of text and context. In this example from field, it looks at the development of everyday and technical meanings. Of course, seeing as the phases indicate an increasing development of the language of text in a more complex world, the number of descriptors at each phase tends to increase. And you can see that phase 1 has only 1 descriptor, while phase 2 has 3, phase 3 has 5, and phase 4 has 6 descriptors. With the language organising tool, the same idea has been used regarding setting out the descriptors so that the reader should, as much as possible, be able to follow a language feature across the various phases. And this shows the first language feature to be descriptions of choices of processes, participants, and circumstances. And this shows the development of the resources for forming multiple clause sentences. Given everything presented so far, what are the logistical considerations in using the Continuum? First of all, since reporting is undertaken at certain endpoints in the academic year, we need to think about how we connect the Continuum with the assessments we've done during a term, say. There are 2 main options. One way is that before these endpoints, the text for each student could be assigned the most relevant phase that each text indicates. The phase or phases that several texts have been assigned are added up, and the median phase level is the one that the student is reported on. Now, ideally, these texts should be of various genre and registers so that there is a good chance that it identifies whether a student is strong in certain language choices and weaker in others. Of course, there's always the issue of manageability, but we would say that the minimum number of texts involved should be 2 texts and the maximum would be 4 texts. If this option is used, then it requires all teachers to assess according to known criteria and know how to assign a phase level to the assessment. And this would be a long-term task. One other way is for certain knowledgeable teachers in the school to function as the assessors, using the descriptions in the Continuum. So at the end points, these teachers come together with collated texts for each student and they assign a phase level for each text and then a median phase for reporting. And this has costs and benefits. One benefit is that the people doing the assessing are knowledgeable about the language descriptions in the Continuum and are likely to be accurate. Another benefit is that it could be a quicker process. However, the main cost is that the knowledge about language and the need to use the continuum stays with only a few people, and they are seen as responsible for everything to do with language. This goes against a very theoretical framing of the continuum. It's not just the language development continuum, it's the language and learning development continuum. As with everything, a tool needs to be manageable for it to be taken on readily, and so one could see the successful application of the continuum in a school or system as a long-term process, and so one could move between options at various points in the process depending on the resources available at the time, human resources as well as time and financial resources. We wish you great success in using the continuum to the benefit of you, your students, and the wider school community.